ながら、チェック機構を欠く国家資本主義は、国内外で大きな不作業を伴う行動をするリスクが高いことは、歴史が示すところです。民主主義の普遍的な価値観を守りながら、新しい時代に向けて経済社会を大きく転換していく、すなわち Great Transformation of a Liberal Democratic Society を目指していきます。米国のバイデン政権のビルドバックベター、EU の次世代 EU も同じ目的を持った歴史的な社会変革のイニシアティブだと理解しています。選挙による国民の厳しい評価を受けながら、経済社会変革をしっかり進めていきます。そのためには、主要国の政府や産業界、労働界のリーダーが協調し、世界的に政策パラダイムの大きなうねり、歴史の潮流を作っていくことが重要です。日本は我が国が来年の G7 議長国を務めることを見据えながら、新しい資本主義によって世界の流れをリードするとの思いを持って、資本主義の進化の実例を示していきます。コップに半分入っているから、コップは半分空であるに変わるとき、イノベーションの機会が生まれる。経営学者 P.E. ドラッカーのコップ理論です。日本は豊かで住みやすく穏やかな国、自分のサイロに閉じこもり、半分入っているになりがちです。しかしながら、コロナを経て時代は急激に変わっています。地球規模の危機を実感する時代、国民一人一人、事業者それぞれが半分からであるという思いを共感すれば、日本は持ち前の団結力を生かして大きく変貌できると確信をしています。私が目指す新しい資本主義では、日本の経済社会が直面する歴史的挑戦の全体像を国民に分かりやすく示します。その上で、市場や競争に全てを任せるのではなく、官と民が経済社会変革の全体像を共有しながら、変革のために協働していくことを重視します。日本の連帯感の強さは、新しい官民共同の土台となります。そして、投資を引き出す新しい仕組み、また、付加価値分配のあり方を変えるための新しい仕組み、これらを成長戦略、分配戦略、それぞれに埋め込んでいくことで、成長と分配の好循環を本格的に回していきます。日本はパリ協定の実現に向け、2030年度 46% 削減、2050年カーボンニュートラルの目標にコミットしています。目標達成の道のりは極めてチャレンジングです。国際的な電力グリッドを持たず、福島第一原発事故による原発不信が強く残り、再生可能エネルギーも山多く海深い島国のためコスト高にならざるを得ません。これが日本経済の弱みになっています。こうした供給面での弱みを克服するために、需要供給両面にわたる炭素中立社会への変革とイノベーションに官民が共同して集中的に取り組みます。早期に投資を倍増するための制度改革や政策支援、次世代グリッドなどの前倒し整備、さらに産業構造や個人消費を変革するカーボンプライシングや労働市場改革などです。これまで政治的に困難だった政策も気候変動への国民の危機感を背景に大胆に取り組んでいきます。また、アジアには我が国と似たエネルギー構造を持っている国も多くあります。EU が冷戦下での欧州石炭鉄鋼共同体から始まったように、 地政学、地形学両面で難しさが増すアジアで、ゼロエミッション技術の開発や水素インフラでの国際共同投資、共同資金調達、技術標準化、アジア排出権市場などを内容とするアジアゼロエミッション共同体を目指していきます。もう一つの重要な柱はデジタル化です。日本ではデジタル化が不十分でした。原因はこれまで慣れ親しんだ仕事のやり方を変えたくないという変革意識の欠如です。しかし、コロナ禍で多くの人がデジタル化の遅れと利便性を改めて認識しました。また、過疎化や高齢化の進展は、日本の社会課題解決にはデジタルの力が不可欠との気づきをもたらしました。今がチャンスです。この機に日本のデジタル化を一気呵成に進めます。重要なのはインフラです。日本を周回する海底ケーブルを整備し、列島全体に光ファイバー網を張り巡らせます。また、大規模データセンターを日本各地に分散させ、本格的なデジタル時代の到来によるデータ処理量の急増に備えます。さらには、現在の100倍の速度と10分の1の省電力化を実現する光通信技術を使って次世代ネットワークを推進していきます。官民で数値目標を掲げ、計画的に整備し、超高速大容量の回線を一個人一回線で利用できるようにしていきます。新たなビジネスサービスには既存の制度が適合しません。4万件の規制制度をデジタル原則の下で見直します。ドローン、自動走行、医療、教育など新たなルールを作ることで新たな市場を創出することが重要です。今から3年前、ダボスの地で我が国が提唱したデータフリーフロー with Trust DFFT をさらに前に進めます。信頼という基盤の上にイノベーションをもたらし、富の格差の解消につながる自由なデータ流通を実現させます。炭素中立型社会、そしてデジタル両方の分野の鍵が人への投資です。人が持つ独創性や創造力といった力が課題解決やイノベーションの源泉となる時代です。日本企業は長年コストを抑え、他社より安い製品の供給競争を戦ってきました。この中で人への投資はコストとみなされ、賃金は上がらず、人材育成などへの投資も抑制されてきました。これからは人への投資が持続的な企業価値の向上につながり、さらなる人的投資を呼ぶという好循環を作らなければなりません。雇用能力教育のための新たなプログラムや、女性の幹部登用の拡大、副業の活用など、デジタル社会への変革にふさわしい人的資本を支えるシステムを作っていきます。その際、企業だけでなく、市場関係者との間で人への投資が企業価値の源泉となるという共通認識を作り、中長期的な企業価値向上を進める企業により多くの資金が集まる仕組みを作っていくことが重要です。そのために日本では人的資本投資など非財務投資に関する開示制度を作っていきます。日本はこれまで金融緩和、財政拡大、成長戦略を3本柱として世界標準のコーポレートガバナンスなども含めたアベノミクスを掲げてきました。アベノミクスの結果、日本経済はもはやデフレではないという状況となり、女性の労働参加拡大、雇用の拡大などを成し遂げました。 このようにアベノミクスは大きな成果を上げましたが、持続可能で包摂的な日本経済に変革していくためには、これまでの取り組みだけでは不十分なことは明らかです。私の内閣では、アベノミクスが成し遂げたマクロ経済や市場関連の実績を土台として、グリーントランスフォーメーション、デジタルトランスフォーメーションなど、日本の経済社会の変革を大胆に進めていきます。国民の危機感を背景に、日本経済の弱点と言われている分野の克服に、国民の挑戦と投資を集中的に引き出していく仕組みをデザインし、実装していきます。今、我々はグレートリセットの先の世界を描いていかなければなりません。新しい時代を切り開くためには、価値観や置かれている状況、立場の違いを超えて対話を積み重ねることで、多くの人が信頼によってつながることが極めて重要です。ダボス会議は長年にわたり、まさにそうした精神を体現する場として、世界中の政治、経済のリーダーを引きつけてきました。今後ますます政治と経済がそれぞれの立場を超え、共に公について議論をし、行動していくことが重要になる中で、この場の重要性が高まっていくと確信します。シュワブ会長をはじめ WEF の皆様、聴衆の皆様のますますのご発展を記念し、私のスピーチとします。ご清聴ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much, Prime Minister, for this forward-looking approach. You have really presented to us a comprehensive framework for what you, and I quote you, for the transformation of a liberal democratic society. You highlighted the different aspects. I think we have to use the capabilities of the fourth industrial revolution to lead our populations and populations to new capabilities and possibilities. I would like to, you mentioned already all the different aspects, but I would like to come back to the new capitalism. And you said that the new capitalism also includes industries and governments working together, and you spoke about new mechanism. Could you explain to a certain extent more in depth what you mean with new forms of cooperation between business and governments, and how it will help to advance your reform plans?
はい。グリーン、デジタル、人への投資、さらには健全な中間層の保持、レジリエンスといった、世界が直面する21世紀型の挑戦に対して、市場競争の偏重、あるいは、協情的な小さな政府路線を続けて、これに対応しようとしても、もはや行き詰まっていると考えます。新たな官民共同の仕組みをデザインしていかなければ、持続可能な、そして包摂的な経済システムは実現できないと考えます。新しい官民共同の仕組み作りや市場メカニズムの手直しにあたっては、金融市場や世界市場などに関連してグローバルに共通の仕組みを必要とするものと、社会の成り立ちや政治状況など各国の地域の特性に合わせて仕組みを作っていくもの、この両方があると思います。我が国も新しい資本主義を段階的に実行していく中で、多層的に検討して全体として最も効果的な官民共同の仕組みを作っていきたいと考えます。 炭素中立、デジタル、人への投資、経済安保などの分野で、この我が国の取り組みの遅れに対する国民の危機感は大変強いものがあると思います。これを逆手にとって、我が国の弱点をこの挽回するための集中的取り組みを正面から訴えて、そして実行する、国民の危機感を背景に、政策面でのリープフロッグ、これを狙いたいと思います。例えばデジタル分野においては 5G の人口カバー率2年程度で9割に引き上げ、日本を一周する海底ケーブルを3年程度で整備するなど、日本列島全体での次世代通信インフラ整備とデジタル規制体制への全体的見直し、これらを通じて民間の投資資金を引き出し、そしてデジタル投資倍増に取り組む、同時にデジタルディバイド対策のきめ細かい政策、これも自治体とともに進めていきたいと思います。グリーン分野ということで申し上げるならば、需給両面で産業構造変革と、そして行動変容が必要となります。この分野への投資を早急に倍増させ、そして成長のエンジンとします。欧米の本格的導入を睨みつつ、カーボンプライシングの枠組み、これも早期に提唱したいと思っています。さらにアジア共同排出権市場の整備、技術協力、あるいは共通インフラなどに対する大規模民間投資の後押し、これも行っていきたいと思います。そして分配、この所得の分配についても新たな仕組みが必要だと思っています。特に人への投資を抜本的に拡大いたします。例えば早期に倍増させ、その上を目指すことは成長戦略と分配戦略双方の観点から重要だと考えています。次世代の担い手となる子育て世代、また若者世代の世帯所得を集中的に高めるために、勤労者皆保険制度など制度改正やデジタル時代型の雇用能力訓練、さらには労働市場改革、こうしたものに取り組んでいきたいと思っています。官主導で、日本の産業の競争力、影響力が高まっていくのかというのが質問のご趣旨だと思いますが、公平性に対する許容度やメディアによるチェック機能が違うので、国家資本主義的な産業政策を民主主義国が講じることは困難であると思っています。しかしながら21世紀型の挑戦に対する国民の危機感は高まっており、我が国の弱点を克服するために、明らかに弱みとなっているこの分野で、民間投資や人的投資をスピードアップするための支援をしたり、また大規模インフラ整備の加速化など、新しい資本主義の具体化の中で積極的に行っていく考えです。こうした21世紀型のキャッチアップ政策の余地、これは主要国の中で広がっているのではないかと私は考えています。
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. We see how you take a very systemic approach to improve Japan's competitiveness and really to transform its economy to the requirements we have to become much greener, much more digital, and much more human-centered. Now, if I may switch to a certain extent the topic, and I know, Prime Minister, you have you have served your country also as a Minister for Defense and as a Foreign Minister. So I would like to ask you the following question. The security condition around Japan and regional tensions are getting increasingly worrisome. Could you share the basic principles of how you envision your country's diplomatic strategy in the framework of the global tensions which we see?
はい、おっしゃるように、日本を取り巻く安全保障環境、大変、厳しくなっている、厳しさを増していると感じています。北朝鮮は、最近も相次いでミサイルを発射するなど、ミサイル技術を著しく向上させています。東シナ海、南シナ海では一方的な現状変更の試み、ますます深刻さを増しています。そして、米中間では外交安全保障の分野のみならず、先端技術や重要物資の獲得競争など、経済を含む様々な分野で競争が激しさを増しています。一方、中国の経済力や各国経済との緊密な結びつき、これを無視することはできません。こうした厳しさと、そして複雑さを増すこの国際情勢の中で、私は未来へのこの理想の旗、これはしっかり掲げ続けなければならないと思っていますが、その上でしたたかで徹底的な現実主義を貫く新時代リアリズム外交、これを展開していきたいと考えています。こうした考え方のもと、まずは自由や民主主義、法の支配、また人権、こうした普遍的価値を重視していきたいと思います。その中で、例えば自由で開かれたインド太平洋の実現に力を尽くしていきたいと思っています。また、核軍縮ですとか気候変動問題など、地球規模の課題においても、我が国はリーダーシップを発揮し、そして国際社会における発言力や存在感、これを高めていきたいと考えています。こうしたこの普遍的な価値、あるいは地球規模の課題、こうしたところにしっかりと焦点を当てて外交を進めていきたいと考えています。
Prime Minister, thank you. We are followed by numerous business leaders, but I would like just to invite two business leaders on behalf of the business community to raise questions. And I ask first Christoph Weber, who is the CEO of Takeda Pharmaceutical, to raise the next question.
Thank you. Thank you, Prime Minister Kishida-san, for your address and vision, which we are very much supporting. My question is about economic security. We all know it's a very pressing issue, and it has a consequence of many countries localizing their supply chain. At the same time, we see that it can impact the free flow of innovation. We also know that complex manufacturing processes always utilize components which can be sourced globally, which have to be sourced globally. So with this in mind, how do you see the industry and trade policy evolving in the future? Thank you very much.
はい、グローバルなサプライチェーンの脆弱性ですとか、国家、地域間の相互依存リスクの顕在化が進む中にあって、世界各国が戦略的物資の確保、また重要技術の獲得にしのぎを削る政策、これを展開している。これが現代の社会です。こうした世界的な動きに対応するためには、日本のこの経済構造の 自律性の向上と、そして技術の優位性、ひいては不可欠性の確保、基本的な価値やルールに基づく国際秩序の維持、強化、これを目指すことが重要だと思っています。同時に、こうした分野に民間投資をしっかり呼び込む、安定的な経済成長を実現していくためにも、企業がグローバルにビジネスを進めていく際の予見可能性と、そして公平な競争環境、これを確保することが必要であると考えます。こうした観点から、主要国の関係当局や産業界でグローバルなルールや手続きを早急に整備していくことが必要です。経済安保はデジタル、炭素中立と並んで各国の精力的な取り組みが求められる21世紀型のグローバルルールの中核になると認識をします。そしてこの我が国で今開かれている国会においては、サプライチェーンの強靭化への支援、そして基幹インフラの信頼性確保等に関する新たな法律の提出を目指しているところです。
Thank you, Prime Minister. I would like now to call on Mr. Benoit Potier, the Chairman and CEO of Air Liquide, for the next question.
Yes, good evening, Prime Minister. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'll come back on the climate issue. All of us are working toward net zero. So what are the next steps and the necessary actions that Japan needs to take, and more specifically, as we confront this energy crisis with supply-demand imbalance and price shock, can Japan achieve its carbon neutrality without harming the stable energy supply and the economic growth? Thank you.
はい、人類共通の課題である気候変動問題ですが、私たち日本人は自然と調和しながら歴史を紡いできた、こういった歴史を持っています。気候変動問題への対応もぜひ主導していきたいと考えています。気候変動対策を進める上で、温室効果ガス排出の8割以上を占めるエネルギー分野の取り組みが特に重要になります。温室効果ガスの排出削減とともに、将来にわたって安定的でそして安価なエネルギー供給を確保し、さらなる経済成長につなげるため、クリーンエネルギー戦略を策定して、供給側に加えて産業など需要側の各分野でのエネルギー転換に向けた企業投資を具体的に後押しするための方策を具体化していきたいと考えています。今後事業者それぞれ、そして国民一人一人が仕事のやり方を、そして自分の強みを、また生活のスタイルを炭素中立型に変えていくためにはどうするべきかといった幅広い議論を行っていきたいと思っています。そうした中で具体的にどの分野でいつまでにどのくらいの投資を引き出すのか、国としてどういう仕掛けをするのかといった方針を取りまとめていきますが、早急にこの分野への投資、少なくとも倍増させたいと考えています。特に再エネ大量導入時代に向けた総配電インフラのバージョンアップ、蓄電池へのこの投資強化、再エネ、また水素、アンモニア、原子力など非炭素電源の技術革新、投資強化、産業構造の転換などについて議論を深めていきたいと考えています。
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. You mentioned in your introductory remarks the importance of digital transformation, your efforts to accelerate digital transformations through regulatory and administrative reform. Now, what do we expect particularly from business in the framework of public-private collaboration? And here, many of Japan has leading business in the digital area, but many are also of are global businesses. What do you expect particularly from business and global businesses to help in the digital transformation process?
はい、新型コロナの影響が長引く中で、デジタル化の遅れを改めて、強く認識をしています。また高齢化や過疎化などの、社会課題、に、直面する、地方にこそ新たなデジタル技術を活用するニーズがあると考えます。このためこの機を捉え、日本のデジタル化一気に進めていきます。デジタルの活用にはインフラ整備、サービスの実装、ルール等の整備、これを一体的に進めることが必要です。まず光ファイバー、5G などのインフラを国が率先して整備をします。5G の人口カバー率を2年程度で9割に引き上げ、日本を一周する海底ケーブルを3年程度で整備いたします。さらに遠隔医療、オンライン教育、スマート農業などを実装し、先導的な取り組みを全国展開いたします。こうした新たなビジネスは既存の制度とぶつかることもあるため、この現状の法令など4万件を一括で改正するプランを取りまとめて、新たなルールの下でドローン、自動走行などの実装を後押ししてまいります。その際に、ぜひ国の内外の企業からも投資をお願いしたいと思います。ぜひ多くの投資を歓迎したいと我々は思っています。
Thank you, Prime Minister. We are running out of time, and if you may allow me, I have a last question which I raise on the specific request of some business leaders. Of course, there are growing concerns about the Omicron variant. I think there were 30,000 cases in Japan. But the question is, or the concern of the business community is certainly relaxation of the strict border measures. And my question, therefore, would be, could you please share your plan to balance between countermeasures against pandemic and economic activities in the future?
はい、11年前、我が国においては東日本大震災が発災しました。その際に我が国は高いレベルの国民の自主的な連帯と協力を世界に示しました。この日本の強みは高いワクチン接種率と相まって効果を発揮しています。昨年夏のデルタ株感染拡大でも世界的に見て極めて低い重症率あるいは死亡率を示しました。オミクロン株に対していわゆるゼロコロナポリシーは不可能でありますし、これは適切ではないと考えます。これまでも発揮された日本社会の強みを最大限生かして社会経済活動を維持しつつ、リスクの高い高齢者層を守り、死亡率を最小化することに全力を今挙げています。高齢者弱者保護を重視する日本社会の価値観をベースとした慎重な対応を取っていると理解していただきたいと思います。こうした対策を実施している間に国内の 医療体制やワクチン、検査、飲める治療薬による予防、発見から早期治療の流れを強化することができました。現状においては、国内外の感染状況の差、これは明らかであり、当面の対応として、2月末まで現在の水際対策の骨格を維持することといたしました。国民からも厳格な水際対策を求める声が強いことにご理解をいただきたいと思っています。なお、その際に人道上、また国益上重要であり、緊急性の高い入国については、例外的な入国を特別に認める、このようにしているところです。今後については、オミクロン株に関する科学的知見が次第に明らかになってくる中で、必要な見直しは柔軟に行ってまいります。例えば先般、従来株と比べて潜伏期間が短いとの科学的知見を踏まえ、入国者の待機期間の短縮、これを行いました。新型コロナによる世界的な危機を人類の英知で乗り越え、皆さんと再び対面でお会いしてお話ができることを楽しみにしております。そのために今全力を尽くしていきたいと考えています。
Mr. Prime Minister Kishida-san, thank you for sharing with us your promising roadmap for the future. Very comprehensive. You can rely on us to accompany you in this journey. And I would also add, related to the last question, I think I speak on behalf of all here business leaders and who is participating in this session. We are very much looking forward to visit personally again your wonderful country. And we hope also to see you one day in person in the wonderful snow of Davos. So thank you for joining us today, and we wish you all the best.
はい、塩部会長をはじめ皆さんの協力に感謝申し上げます。ありがとうございました。
Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. And thank you to our distinguished panelists. Now, all of you in the audience should have their names and bios clearly on your screens, but just in case, I'm going to quickly introduce them. We have Sharon Burrow, General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation. Nadia Calvino, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Economic Affairs and Digital Transformation of Spain. Jonas Priesing, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Manpower Group. Nicola Schmidt, European Commissioner for Jobs and Social Rights. Svein Tore Holseter, President and Chief Executive Officer of Yara International. Now, today we are going to be talking about solutions to the great inequality caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. It's clear after more than 2 years of the world with COVID-19 that this was a pandemic of inequality, that the haves and the have-nots have been affected very differently by the pandemic. And this is true in global, sort of cosmic terms, if you will, so across different geographies where you happen to live, but also at the local and individual level. And this is true in terms of the suffering from the disease, in terms of being affected by the policies introduced because of the virus, and from the overall economic toll. COVID created inequalities, but also exacerbated existing ones. And of course, we are seeing the consequences of this growing disparity, not only in economic terms, but also in political ones. So today, we are here to talk about what happens next, how we emerge from the crisis, what policies are needed, what partnerships, what compact is needed across all areas of economy and society. Very quickly, for all of you in the audience, a note of housekeeping. You can all ask questions by using Slido. You scan the QR code on the screen, select the session, post your queries. Now, to the panelists, I'd like to jump right in, and I'd like to warm us up, because this is quite a heavy topic. I'd like to warm us up with a lightning round question for all of you, really just a 30-second answer or 5-second answer even. And that question is, how long do each of you think that the scars of this pandemic will be with us? Are we talking months, years, decades, a century? I would like your quick prognosis. So let's begin, it's, on the screen, it's Harvard. Minister Calvino, let's begin with you, and then we'll do a quick round.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Indeed, I'm happy to kickstart, to put the ball in the playing ground. And I think that the impact is going to be extremely different depending on the circumstances of the countries. You already flagged that there's been a very unequal response. I think that in developed countries, we have focused a lot in avoiding inequalities. We've focused a lot in protecting citizens, protecting companies and jobs. Also, we've had access to the vaccines. And that, I think, is leading to a very limited scarring. In the case of Spain, for example, job numbers have recovered in around 15 months as compared to 12 years after the past financial crisis. But of course, the impact may be very different in most vulnerable countries. So we really have to get the recovery right to make sure that the potential structural impact is as small as possible, as little as possible throughout the world. And I think this will depend greatly on vaccination and the availability and access to vaccines, and also on financial stability, probably two of the issues we should be focusing on in the coming weeks and months.
Absolutely. Commissioner Schmidt.
Well, I fully agree with what Nadia has said. The scars depend a lot on our solutions. As in Europe now, we have been able to mobilize a lot of energy, a lot of measures, including also the recovery and resilience plan. The scars are already disappearing, depending also on vaccination and on the evolution of the pandemic. But I think what will remain, and I would even say what should remain with us, is the awareness of our fragility. And I think this is something we have to work on. We have been taken by surprise with this pandemic, although some announced this kind of big pandemic. And we have now to prepare for the next pandemic or for events we are not sure, but which may occur. And this is for the next coming years. We have to work on this fragility in our societies, and we have to build up solutions to cope with that.
Great. So years for sure. Both of you are indicating years, but obviously with difference, it depends where you began with, which is clearly a very good point. Secretary Burrow.
Well, it'll take at least a decade, and that's only then if the solutions that generate a new social contract are in place and it's inclusive of everybody. Because the pandemic has shown that if one person is at risk through unvaccination or unjust development or, lack of social protection for resilience, we're all at risk. So we need a new social contract, and it needs to be inclusive, and it needs to recognise that the inequality and indeed the integration of crisis with climate started before the pandemic. This has simply laid out a much deeper crater. And the big challenge is indeed to rebuild trust, because what's at risk here is the very democracies and the trust in democracies that can put in place that social contract.
Yeah. You raised the word trust, which is clearly a very, very important one, which I'm sure that we will come back to. Mr. Priesing.
I would probably characterize it as a little bit more optimistic. I think the scarring that you describe from the pandemic is, in my view, more a question of highlighting pre-existing, pre-pandemic differences between the haves and the have-nots that have now been exacerbated, and some of the structural changes to labor markets have been accelerated. And I think what it's highlighted is that while we're all in the same ocean, we're clearly all not in the same boat. So I'm more optimistic on the short-term rebound once we get to post-pandemic on the immediate pandemic-related labor market impact. And we've seen it already in terms of unemployment bouncing back very quickly and the impact on people's earnings actually being reasonably limited and wage inflation being very strong. So I think the labor markets have navigated this well. Individuals within the context of the pandemic have navigated it well, but it highlights the need to address the deep-rooted inequalities in the labor market that's otherwise, just as Sharon said, is going to impact us and our societies and our workers in a way that is very, very unequal.
And you raise an important point, which of course is another aggravator here, which of course is inflation, which is also the result of pandemic supply chain issues, also others, but in addition, pandemic related issues. So that's another point that we interesting to go back to. Mr. Holzhauer.
Well, it's really impossible to answer, but I still believe it's still within our power to influence the length of how long it will take for this. But and we have good examples of strong response to this, and we also have some really negative examples. And I believe the distribution of vaccines and access to vaccines, it's shameful, and many have been left out, and that goes straight to the topic that Sharon raised on trust. How are we going to rebuild trust after this? So that will be key. But also there are some learnings here that are very relevant in other crises that we're faced with, like the climate crisis. That when we're faced with a common threat, how we're able to get together, how we for this time listened to science, and science was able to come up with solutions. That's something that is very relevant also in the climate crisis. So there are some positive learnings that we can bring with us as well.
Yes, and you know, your point about science is actually very related to trust. I mean, we see it in the media business in my industry that there's been actually increased trust in the media business because we have been talking to scientists who have been giving us numbers and who have been giving us facts, and that actually the population is more in tune with that, if you will. Okay, thank you for setting the scene here. I'd like to turn to the policymakers here, because you know, clearly governments around the world have done a lot, you know, objectively within this pandemic, from policy measures to financial instruments. Commissioner Schmidt, so as we said, there have been a slew of measures, you know, to help populations, particularly, you know, workers and employers during lockdowns. But clearly there are limitations. National budgets are limitations, and also a pandemic that is still, you know, very uncertain. So what needs to be done next? And in particular, picking up on what Secretary Barrot does, what does this compact need to look like from the policymaker side?
Well, I think that the pandemic has revealed a lot of issues and exasperated issues, which we should have already been prepared to work on and to solve. And I think this is the big lesson out of this pandemic. It's about resilience, it's about trust, it's about the broken social contract we had. I think we are talking now about developing a new social contract. This means, in a way, that before the pandemic, this social contract was probably even broken, at least put into question.
And I think these are the lessons we should learn out of the pandemic now. First, that some approaches we thought that could not be changed had to be changed very rapidly. That was the economic response to the economic impact of the pandemic. If we had followed the orthodoxy, we would be nowhere. So I think this is an important thing we have to build on. The second one is, well, society exists. You remember this famous phrase of Margaret Thatcher, that there is no such thing as society. We have discovered that society exists, and we need society. And we have to rebuild our societies. We have to rebuild solidarity in our societies. And part of the pandemic, we are in a tremendous moment of change, because the pandemic has not changed or diminished the impact of climate change. I think this is at least, or even a bigger challenge for our societies, for our economies, for the world of work, and we have really to continue and even amplify our measures in relation to climate change. Technology is there. Technology has helped us a lot in this pandemic, because our economies would have run even worse if we had not a very rapid adaptation to technological means. But finally, remains the division in our societies, inequalities. They were before the pandemic, they have been exasperated after. And I think that's the issue about the new social contract. We have to bring in new policies, new ways how to see social investment, how to invest in people, how to reduce these inequalities in our societies. That's the big challenge. In order to cope with the climate change, technological, demographic transformations. And I think here the pandemic can help us, can be an accelerator, but they can also, if we do not draw the right solutions, it can also worsen the situation. But that would then be a problem of trust, of democratic rights, of the cohesion of our societies.
But so your points are well taken, but let's speak, let's give a few specifics here. So, you know, Minister Calvino, okay, so everything the commissioner says, you know, makes sense, but he talked about solidarity. We have not always seen solidarity. Often we've seen brinkmanship, in fact. And so, okay, so what in practice, what are the instruments then that now, as I cannot say we are emerging because we are still in it, but if we look at a time where we emerge from the health crisis, what are the instruments, what are the initiatives that need to remain?
Well, actually, I think that, as I said in my introductory remark, I think that to some extent we learned the lessons from the past financial crisis. And at least insofar as developed countries, most developed countries are concerned, and in particular, that's the case with the EU, as Commissioner Nicolas Schmit was highlighting. I think the response to this crisis has been totally different from the last financial crisis. There has been, first of all, a coordinated response on the health front, and that has been instrumental for the development of the vaccines, but also to guarantee that all Europeans have access to those vaccines. But also on the economic and social front, where we have all deployed an unprecedented massive program of public guarantees, support to short-term work schemes, a social protection network for the most vulnerable part of our societies. So we have focused very much on citizens, on this society that Nicolas was saying maybe 15 years ago people were suggesting did not exist. And we have also, I think, become increasingly aware that the public sector and public services are absolutely essential, that there is a social infrastructure that we need to protect if we want to ensure long-term resilience. Health sector, education, we have become aware of our vulnerabilities, but also where we need to put our money and our investment and our focus going forward. So I would say that the response has been very different, both from a short-term perspective, short-term reaction to provide financial stability, vaccines, etc., but also from the mid to long run perspective, because we have put in place this massive investment program, investment and structural reform program. For the first time in the EU, we are borrowing together in order to invest together in our common future. And therefore, there is a focus on long-term sustainability from the economic and financial point of view, but also from the social and environmental point of view, which is new. And I would close this reflection by saying, and this is building a new global orthodoxy to a certain extent. So all financial institutions, international financial institutions, multilateral fora, the Davos Forum, and public-private partnership and dialogue, and the academia. Everybody is now realizing that reducing inequalities should be one of the top priorities of sustainable growth in the mid to long run. And so the two go together, growth and equality or fairness. And we need a fair recovery if we want it to be sustainable throughout time.
Let me quickly, but just for a nanosecond, press you. You said, it is clear where we need to put our money. Clarify that for us then.
Well, for example, just to give you the example of the Spanish recovery plan, we're going to devote around 40% of investments to the green transformation agenda, 30% of investments to the digital transformation agenda, around 10% of investments, education, vocational training, digital skills for the whole of the population. There's also a very strong focus on developing new social infrastructures. So our whole recovery plan, not to speak about the structural reforms, we can maybe come back to this in a second round, labor market, pensions, and other important structural reforms. But in terms of investment, I think we're really putting our money where our mouth is and focusing on future-proof investments in order to foresee or to ensure that there is a strong recovery, but also a fair recovery, thinking about future generations.
Got it. And also you raised that essentially the global social contract needs to include an environmental dimension to it. Perhaps we'll come back to that. Let me move to the role of business leaders then, in setting this agenda, for the new social contract, for creating a fairer workplace. Mr. Holzetter, what is the role here in detail, in detail and in what can actually be done?
Well, I think it's an important and clear premise that business will not thrive in a society that is not thriving. And this means that we, from the business side, need to think much broader than just focusing on our own, say, individual P&Ls or balance sheet. We need to move from the traditional shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. And this, I think, is both needed and expected. And we saw this this morning in the annual Edelman Trust Barometer that was published, and where we see that business is the most trusted institution, and that the respondents were very clear that they expect businesses to play a larger role, whether it's on climate change, on economic inequality, racial injustice, and workforce reskilling. So the expectation is there, and here I believe it's the strength of the purpose-driven companies that all companies should ask themselves, what is the purpose of their existence? And if that answer is just to make money, I think we need to rethink why do they exist in the first place. It is about playing a role in society, about creating jobs, about creating solutions. And as the Edelman survey concludes with, societal leadership is now a core function of business. So I think this is changing a lot now.
So just to follow up quickly on what you just said, you seem to be the optimist here in this group, and and you pointed out that during the pandemic, that actually institutions, businesses, and businesses, you pointed, by the way that they acted, have increased trust. And yet, when we look at what's happening in the world around us, there are things to be concerned about at the geopolitical level, but also what we're seeing on the streets. People are taking to the streets. There is, questions even about democracy. So how do you see, it seems to me that trust does need to be the bedrock of this new social contract, but how do you see that playing out? Just very quickly as a follow-up to this, and then we'll go to Secretary Barrow.
Yeah, well, the reason I am optimistic is that I've seen it in practice now in the pandemic with a company that has a very clear purpose, where the organization understands what is it that we contribute within society and a need for doing that locally. We had to take some very tough decisions that we're in this situation, we're not going to be able to sort of remote control a global business. We have to delegate the ownership of that, empower people, and have the combination of empowerment and a very clear purpose. We see what our organization is able to do in the societies where we operate. And at the end of the day, trust is built on what we're doing in practice. And we see what we're in the ag industry, what we can do for helping farmers to produce more food, to combat hunger and so on. It's examples like this, I think, that are needed, and that's what makes me optimistic on what we can do.
Great. Sorry, I said I was going to Secretary Barrow, but I'm saving you for the end, Secretary Barrow. I want to go to Mr. Preezing. You're at the forefront of this, obviously. Through your company, how much of all of this is realistic, and how much of it instead is, or how much does it have to be hand in hand with reskilling? A population that needs to emerge from the old ways of working and needs to find new ways of approaching the labor market. What is needed from your point of view? Because then I want to draw us in the second round to real solutions in the specific.
I think one of the big and maybe one of the few positives of the pandemic is that it's given us a glimpse into the future of what could happen if we don't address some of the structural changes that are occurring in labor markets. And both the Deputy Prime Minister Ventura talked earlier about climate change. And what we've seen over 40 years, looking at data, is that climate change is real and it's happening. It took us 40 years to get to the tipping point, arguably, of the pandemic. And the Deputy Prime Minister, along with many other policymakers and the EU, have plowed in and are allocating significant resources with the full realization that we need to avert a planetary disaster with climate warming. We believe that what we've seen during the pandemic is what could happen in terms of the acceleration of inequality, and that we need to take action now because we actually have the data, that we know that the impact of technology means different skills are needed, and we need to move from different industries and occupations at an accelerated pace. We know individuals have new expectations and preferences, which frankly have been fast forwarded significantly during the pandemic, leveraging and realizing that companies and organizations need to stand for more than profits and a job, and also align with their own ambitions around purpose and sustainability. And we also know that demographically during the pandemic, most birth rates crashed. And it's an acceleration of a trend that's been going on for 30 years. So our call to action is really to think about the S in the ESG in the same vein as you think about climate change, but instead of waiting for these gaps to become so painfully obvious that we're forced to take action, we can anticipate this. And we understand, just as Svein Tore said, as enterprises, we understand we cannot thrive in this if the societies in which we operate aren't thriving. And inequality is bad for business. So businesses and organizations are aligning with that understanding. And that's why you see the emergence and the strong belief in stakeholder capitalism, because we will allocate resources in a way that makes us more successful, including the broader stakeholder view, so we ensure that we can continue to thrive as businesses.
So, Secretary Barrow, bring us here. The reason I came to you last is I kind of want you as a reality check here, right? And so to say, okay, this is all great. This all sounds great. But from your vantage point, I have two questions. What does it look like in pragmatic terms? What does it look like to have this new contract, to have these partnerships, who can disagree about, multi-stakeholders, but what does that look like in practice? First question. Second question, what about your organization and organizations like yours, do they have the structural adequacy to be at the forefront and to push the new labor of the future?
So the first thing is that Sven and Jonas are right about the need for business to reform, to have a mandate that's much vaster than simply making money. Because what we have now is simply a total disconnect between labour income share, which has a 30-year slump, between the fact that only, some 40-odd% of the world have universal social protection as a resilience foundation, and indeed 73% of the world's people have little or no social protection. And when you look at the convergence of crisis, if we don't transform every industry, and that means a responsibility for workers and for jobs, then this crisis, which is exacerbated by the health crisis, will get worse. But when you look at the global labour market, it's broken. You have 60% of the world's workers working informally. No rights, no minimum wage, no social protection. That's a disaster for business, as well as, of course, for the survival of people. And COVID simply exposed that for that 60%, if they don't earn money every day in an economy that's simply shut down, they struggle to survive. The 40% increasingly insecure, short-term contracts, platforms undermining secure work with no regulation. Thanks, Nicholas, for taking this on in the EU. But we are seeing a breakdown in responsibility for human and labour rights. Now, the companies Jonas and Sven are talking about, I work with, and they are putting in place minimum wages. They are committed to dialogue, not so much the American companies, but to social dialogue and collective bargaining, certainly in the European model. And we know that it will take 4 or 5 key demands to enact a social contract for labour. The first is jobs, jobs and jobs, a return to full employment. Those jobs will be different. They will, in fact, require reskilling. They'll require looking at where, indeed, we need to shore up the models of labour rights and social protection. But we must have jobs, and they must be climate-friendly jobs, or you have no hope of putting a floor of confidence or trust or indeed optimism back for business or for people. We need universal social protection, and we've called for a global social protection fund. We need, in fact, universal rights, and that means the restoration of respect for human and labour rights, beginning with freedom of association, the right for workers to actually have a say at the table, and of course to bargain collectively, to share the responsibility for that future. But we need equality. We need equality of income through minimum wages, through collective bargaining, but we also need equality of gender and race. If you look at the plight of COVID for women, $800 billion has been lost. More women have left the labour market. The labour participation of women has simply collapsed. And indeed, we know that we can rebuild this if we invest in those public services you heard the Minister talk about. Because care, whether it's childcare, aged care, healthcare, education, these are good jobs for women and men, but they're also the enabling jobs that allow women to participate in the global labour market. We will not get an inclusive future if business doesn't reform, if climate, inequality and health are not tackled in the context of realising those SDGs, and time is running out.
Secretary Barrot, so we should have, you're saying, and this is one of the questions that actually is coming in, a universal citizen income.
What I'm saying is that for those workers, for those people who are not in work and not earning a minimum living wage, then the social protection system must include an income base. But why would you pay me an income or you an income share that's this amount of money when we earn good wages? We need to look after the solidarity that will include the poorest amongst us. And if we don't build that universal social protection floor, then we will not indeed see any resilience against future shocks. That's bad for business, bad for people, but it also is, as I said, totally undermining our democracies. The model of development now is so unjust. And if you want to put it in really crass terms, vaccine nationalism, 9 new billionaires created in the US alone by the companies who depended on taxpayers' money in part, large part in some cases, for the research, now blocking the intellectual property sharing that would vaccinate the world, which is creating even more risk for all of us.
Commissioner Schmidt, Secretary Burrow is saying Europe has a role to take a lead here. She talked about European companies taking a lead over American ones. So is this your view as well? I mean, what in pragmatic terms can European Union, the EU, Europe do for this contract?
Well, I think we have started before the pandemic. Already the previous Commission adopted with the member states and institutions a European Pillar of Social Rights with very strong, very concrete principles, how we can really rebuild the social contract on jobs, on education, on skills, on equality, men and women equality, on youth, on care. So very concrete rights which in a way compose this new social contract we need, and especially we need in a period of big transformation. And I think we have worked on that. We have presented in last May an action plan, how we can really implement this very concrete rights. And Sharon has mentioned what we have done on minimum wage. We are now about, hopefully, to find an agreement on a framework for minimum wages in the European Union, guaranteeing everybody to have a decent wage for the work people do and having decent living conditions. This is a paradigm shift in a way also for Europe. And Nadia just mentioned how we changed in comparison to the previous crises. We have proposed now a framework for platform work, rights, protection rights, labor rights for platform workers. Not this illusion platform workers are self-employed, are entrepreneurs, and they have no protection whatsoever. We have proposed now a real framework for rights for these platform workers. So I think this is, by the way, a very important proposal because it applies to new forms of economic activity. And I am sure that this will extend to other places in the world where the same problems have coming up. And just my last word is on transition. I think we are in a major transition period. And we have to give people certainly the idea that mobility is needed, from mobility, job mobility, but at the same time, people are asking us for security. They have to organize their lives. They have to be sure for their kids. So we have to find a new paradigm also for our labor markets. And I think how we organize transitions, it's not about giving everybody a minimum income. It's about giving people new opportunities, investing in their skills.
Thank you, Commissioner. And that is good because to a certain extent, it starts to answer some of the questions that are coming in. I'll read, one for you because I think it's really what we're trying to home in on. And one of the questions says, it's good to have dreams and a vision, but on the pragmatic side of things, how can we make the global social contract work? So the Commissioner started, giving a big picture response to that. Minister Calvino, and speak to us perhaps about your own experience in Spain and what that transformation looks like, what those new jobs look like.
Yes, as Nicola was talking, I was thinking about the example of Spain, because to a certain extent, Spain is one of the countries in Europe which has for decades had growth being dragged by the malfunctioning and the dysfunctioning and imbalanced labor market. with very high unemployment, very high youth unemployment, low productivity growth, etc. And I was thinking of three main features, I think, of the response to this crisis and the outlook, which are extremely relevant in this regard. First, in terms of the response to the pandemic, and this is an important comparison between the EU and the US, as Commissioner Schmidt was mentioning. In Europe, we have protected the jobs. In the case of Spain, we estimate that more than 3.5 million workers were protected, more than 1.5 self-employed workers were protected, as compared to previous crises, where a small decline in activity would lead to a massive job destruction. And what we have learned is that it is better to protect, it's cheaper, than to let something be destroyed and then having to rebuild from scratch. And this certainly has allowed the Spanish labor market to recover the pre-pandemic levels in around 15 months, as I said at the beginning, as compared to 12 years from the past financial crisis. There's also a positive side effects to these support measures, in that I think that a part of the informal economy that this was referred to is also coming up and to the formal economy, because many players are realizing that you can have a network and a support framework if you are paying your taxes. Maybe also a positive side effect of this framework. A second element coming out of the crisis is that we are really undertaking a big negotiation with our social partners, and dialogue with society, I think, is instrumental to rebuild this social contract, to design what social contract do we want for the new economic cycle, which is now starting. We just, by the end of December, reached a tripartite agreement with the business organizations and the unions to have a labor market reform in order to reduce temporarity, to provide new flexibility instruments to companies different to extremely high temporarity and precariousness. Also, to move ahead with a very different kind of job creation framework. And let me
I'm going to have to rush you along, because we're nearing the end of
the final one is
communication.
The final point is, indeed, we need to invest in social skills, reskilling and training of the whole society if we want them to be able to cope with the structural transformations taking place. Thank you.
Great. This is the same question to Mr. Holzhauer and Mr. Priesing. What commitment should business make? What single biggest commitment that is numerically, that has a target that can be measured, should business do? Mr. Holzhauer first.
Well, people care, consumers care, but we need to give them the opportunity to direct their spending to support the development in the society. And how can we rebuild trust? How can we create a new social contract with income inequality as we have right now? This coffee cup cost me $3. It's 1 cent is going to the farmer of the coffee beans. And you have 600 million farmers, and very often the ones doing the most important job are paid the least. So if we commit to tracing and the cost and the income, and make that visible to the consumers, I think that's one very concrete key thing that we can do from business at scale that can drive change.
Transparency and tracing. I love it. Mr. Priesing.
Businesses are already very actively involved in reskilling their workforces and upskilling their workforces. And as I highlighted at the beginning, the spotlight on the future of work we are seeing during the pandemic, difficulty to find people with the right skills. So organizations are investing in their workforces to create the talent and the skills that they need from within the organization. But on a broader question, however, I would say the big shift that we have yet to do and that we are not seeing emerge yet is truly the future of work, where employment security is going to be what facilitates the mobility that we need as we're shifting and transforming between industries. And if you think back on a conversation like this 5 years ago, it would have all centered around the threat of AI that was going to destroy all of our jobs, and what do we do with 50% of the workforce that doesn't have, anything to do anymore. And that's a theoretical construct that, even at its time was never actually going to happen. And the data is very clear. The technological impact creates more jobs than it destroys, but it requires different skill sets. And I think we're still mired in old-fashioned labor market policy thinking as we're trying to imagine the future of work. And, when we talk about the investments we're making in climate, 40% of all of these, funds, 50 in some countries, are going to address climate. And yet a small fraction of that, maybe 10, maybe 5%, are going back to support traditional labor market policies. So we are not yet with the understanding of the transformation that is required to support, inclusive growth for everyone, reflecting in the policies that we're pursuing for labor markets.
Great. We're at the closing. I'm going to give the last word to Secretary Burrow. Mr. Priesing talked about we are still in the old labor market paradigm. Okay, so what is the new one? Tell us forcefully and pithily, if you will, because then we need to go to Sadia.
Well, we may differ a little, but Jonas is right on the fact that business has to think differently, but they have to take responsibilities for jobs, secure jobs, for reskilling their workforce. And of course, we need governments to be part of that negotiation around a new social contract. Every sector has to transition for climate. But if we don't transition in a way that protects and creates jobs, then we will see more dislocation, more distrust, more despair. That is the driver of all of those things. Spain has done an enormous amount of work with unions, with business, to actually drive a just transition, to put in place the sorts of legislative frameworks that Nicola is working on at the European level. So we need legislation. We need serious commitment from business on both climate and on secure work. But we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. We're very pleased to work with business who want to actually sit and negotiate, think through jointly with workers at the table what the transition looks like. But sadly, that's not enough of them yet. So much reform is necessary. We also can't count on governments. And I need to say this, some governments, yes, but the geopolitical situation is such that too many governments are dodging the responsibility for climate, for workers, for society generally. And we need to actually have them step up. But we need to work with, indeed, businesses who have a value set around inclusion, who care about workers and their communities and don't leave them stranded. I would just say to you, the social and environmental taxonomy work in Europe, we're optimistic this can become a legislative base. Indeed, we've seen a global standards body set up, but in the International Sustainability Standards Board, it's welcome, but where's the international social standards that actually partner with that? We have a lot of work to do, and the parties that care about an inclusive future with a new social contract have to be very vocal, so we leave no room for others to simply carry on business as usual.
Great. And on that, I must close. I'm just going to say on the words of trust, transition, and transparency, I will leave the closing remarks to Sadia. Thank you so much to our panelists. Sadia, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of the panelists, and thank you, Alessandra. Last week, our global risks report revealed that the topic that experts were most concerned about in terms of worsening risk, its social cohesion across multiple societies that is getting eroded. What you heard today from our phenomenal group of panelists is the sense of urgency, but also the elements of this new social contract that needs to be built or rebuilt in some cases across societies. Better health systems, better education systems, better care systems, both childcare and elder care, better jobs, better paid jobs, social protection systems and income support for those that are going through a reskilling or jobs transition, reskilling and upskilling for adult workforces to deal with both the technological shifts and the green transition, and then finally ensuring that equality and equity is embedded throughout each of these features. What the World Economic Forum will aim to do is help move these features of this new social contract along through a few different initiatives that bring the public and the private sector together. I'll just give you 3 examples. Next week, our global competitiveness report will aim to measure how countries are doing against these elements of a new social contract. That will hopefully help change some of the targets that we're focusing on as economies recover. 2, a new jobs coalition that aims to support investment and innovation in those jobs of tomorrow that Sharon mentioned, but also a focus on standards and wages. And finally, 3, the Reskilling Revolution initiative that seeks to reskill and upskill as well as provide better education to 1 billion people by 2030, already made progress to reach about 100 million people and looking to reach a lot more. Thank you so much, and happy to work with you moving forward. Thank you.
and the Executive Director of Oxfam International, Gabriela Boucher. My panel, welcome. Mike, I want you to set the scene for us. The WHO has described vaccine inequality as the biggest failure of 2021, and now you're campaigning to get 70% of every nation in the world vaccinated by mid-2022. Where are we? It feels like we have a lot of work to do.
Yes, we do, and it's fantastic. An honor to be amongst such a wonderful group. It is. I mean, right now, over half the world's, if we look at the population of the world, in total, over half of the world's population has received 2 doses of vaccine. But if we look at in Africa, in our African regional office states, only 7%. So the reality is that the world is moving towards a 70% goal. The problem is we are leaving huge swathes of the world behind. So it's not a matter, are we in the race? Yes, as a global population, science, innovation has worked. But our ability to distribute those vaccines equitably, both in terms of protecting the most vulnerable everywhere, but also in giving us the best chance to end the public health emergency. Because at the end of the day, this virus will continue to transmit. This virus will be around for a very long time. What we need to do is end the public health emergency. We can end the public health emergency if we end the hospitalizations, if we end the deaths, and if we reduce transmission to a minimum level. We can do that using vaccines and other measures, but vaccines are absolutely central. There is no way out of this pandemic right now without vaccines as the central strategic pillar. And being able to use those vaccines equitably is not only a fair an important humanitarian objective. It is the best way for us all to get out of the pandemic phase that we're currently in right now.
Yeah, and the vaccine vacuum, I think, as you describe it in parts of the world, puts the entire world at risk. We're all at risk here. Seth, come in, because you've just announced that, or COVAX has announced that they've delivered their 1 billionth dose, which is incredible. And I know vaccine productivity and the supply accelerated, particularly in the month of December into January, but it's way off target from where we hope to be. Are the challenges of 2021 the same challenges in 2022, be it supplies, be it logistics, be it money?
So thanks, Julia, and I'll agree with Mike, a great panel to take this on. First of all, we are actually not behind. We actually hit the milestone we originally had set, which was 950 million doses to AMC countries by the end of 2021. But that target was set at a time when we didn't know if any of the vaccines were going to work. And we've been lucky that science has really delivered here. Now, in terms of getting vaccines out, the first vaccine went to a developing country 39 days after the first vaccine in a high-income country. That's never been done before. But then we hit barrier after barrier. We had export bans. We had vaccine nationalisms. We had companies not meeting their requirements to put doses forth. And so what we've had to do is solve each of those problems, raise the money to purchase doses, and ultimately to ask for dose donations, which were not part of the original mandate. With that, we were able to get this back on track, and now you're seeing an accelerated drive towards getting vaccines out. We expect right now the next billion to take, somewhere between 4 and 5 months versus a year. And so we're on our way. Now, the new challenge that is here is making sure that every country is ready to receive them. Countries have tripled their absorption capacity. That's great. But there's 20 to 25 countries that have problems with absorption. And with this, us, with our partners like the AU and AVAT and PAHO and others have been working to try to make sure that we can create bespoke plans for these countries to help them with their absorption capacity.
Gabriela, come in here because Richard Hashett, who was speaking yesterday, he's the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness, CEPI, he was saying it's the last mile is the challenge in 2022, whereas supply was the challenge in 2021. And that's almost what we're hearing. There's a difference between delivering vaccine doses and actually getting them in people's arms, which is a huge challenge too. From your experience, Gabriela.
Well, thanks very much, Julia, and very pleased to be on this panel. And I have to reiterate, looking back on WEF's panels last year, of course, at the time, it was a moment when we were celebrating the fact that science had managed to create this vaccine at such speed, and also the investment of some of the rich governments. around 100 billion was invested in accelerating all that process of getting vaccines out, and there was a lot of hope. But of course, in this meantime, we have seen that, in fact, there has been significant vaccine inequality. And we launched a report yesterday, Inequality Kills. And of course, this vaccine inequality demonstrates it more than anything else. So differences between countries have grown beyond what was seen before. So in this generation, we hadn't seen inequality grow between countries. And we know that at the moment, inequality is a higher predictor of COVID death than age. And that is from a survey done by The Economist magazine. So that demonstrates that we could have actually prevented many of those deaths. We have 5.5 million deaths. And if we had had a different system of approaching this from the beginning, things would have changed. So there were some errors of judgment from the leaders, mostly in the rich world. So vaccine nationalism that was mentioned by Seth was one of them. So hoarding vaccines for themselves from the beginning and leaving other countries to the back of the queue over and over again because boosters when they're needed. And so they jumped again to the front. So this has created that. And then, of course, protecting those monopolies that pharmaceutical companies have over the vaccines, which has meant that it's a laborious process to get those vaccines out, where there could have been a much more immediate way by lifting intellectual property rights from the beginning and allowing vaccines to be produced at scale across the world. That would have been a game changer. And we would have avoided not only deaths directly from COVID, but all the deaths that have been associated with growing inequality and crippled health systems across the world. So it's really tragic, and that's the state in which we are, when we could have foreseen possible solutions, and they mean really thinking differently about how to address this pandemic and any pandemic to come as well.
You basically touched on everything we're going to discuss over the next 30 minutes in that answer there, because there is much in there that we saw and were challenged by last year that we have to tackle and hope to do better this year. But on your point about monopolies, I think this was very important too, and some of the other challenges. And I come in here because you are the biggest vaccine maker in the world by dose. You've partnered with some of the vaccine developers, you manufacture your own, you understand the challenges of distribution. You see both supply and demand. You've pointed in the past few weeks that actually you think it's more of a demand problem, and you cited Africa specifically. Tell me what you see and what you're thinking at this moment.
Well, if you just rewind, firstly, pleasure to talk to you, Julia, and to be on this esteemed panel. If you just rewind a little bit to a year ago, we had committed about producing, 1 billion doses a year. We've actually produced 1.5 billion and actually had to stop production in December because we had 500 million in stock, which meant that we produced 2 billion between January 21 and December 21. It was in October that I was sort of being a little vocal when I was celebrating the fact that the export restrictions had finally been lifted from India. And in no way was I trying to call out or blame anyone. I was only trying to articulate and send the message out there that vaccine supply is no longer a constraint. And, the African continent that we've supplied vaccines to and supported over the last many decades, we're ready to support you again. Please get in touch and, address the vaccine inequality issue wherever you have it. And, here are the doses available for you. Now, they've done a tremendous job, as Seth and everyone else has said, in terms of increasing their absorption capability, and that's happening as well. So we're going to see a shift in the trends, hopefully, and probably supply 1 billion plus doses in the first quarter or two, combined through COVAX to the African continent. So we're in a far different and better place than we were last year.
Yes, and I didn't mean to make it sound accusatory. We all have to work together on this. John, we've spent some time talking about the continent. Please give me your take on this, whether it's the demand, whether it's the need, what more can be done to help?
I think, thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. And let me use the opportunity to wish all of you a very happy and less dramatic 2022. We hope that 2022 should be the year that we remember it as the year that brought this pandemic to an end. And 2022 is, as we move into 2022, is 3 years into this pandemic. If we record a history of a similar pandemic 100 years ago, it took them maybe two years to clear that pandemic. And if you bring back the people that fought that pandemic 100 years ago, they will be amazed by the science. They will truly be tantalized by how speedily science has progressed and how much we could tackle this virus. They will also be very amazed and maybe very, very shameful of the fact that the amount of inequality and inequity that exists, even though science has made tremendous progress. So I think I really wish that we could go back to history and bring back some of those people and ask them their views of if they were here today, what they would do. So what we have seen over the last 2 years is really total collapse of global cooperation and solidarity, period. I think there's absolutely no reason why a continent of Africa should be lagging behind with having 7% of the population fully immunized. A continent of 1.2 billion people is totally unacceptable. It's not the world that the humanity that we want to project. Yes, so I think that has to be underscored. We have to be optimistic in moving forward, but we have to record the past. A famous historian said, if you don't know where you are coming from, you really don't know where you are going to. I think that has to continue to guide us, that the moral failures that we witnessed over the last 2 years cannot repeat itself again in 2022. We remain optimistic in Africa that as a continent, we should strive to get to the 70% target, but we're around 10%. Okay, how do we get from 10% to 70%? Right. We really have to bring all forces to bear, increase our global cooperation, partnership, solidarity, and coordination to try to move from where we are to 70%, recognizing that it is only through that massive efforts, coordinated efforts, that we shall all be safe. We've seen what Omicron has done. I mean, Omicron, and we all said this at the start, that if we did not protect this and vaccinate at scale and at speed, even those who have been vaccinated will be challenged. And we have seen what Omicron has done. We truly don't know what the next variant will look like. And the only way to prevent other variants challenging the global efforts and the advances that we have seen is to vaccinate at scale and at speed, including Africa.
The question is how. Seth, come in here because you heard that and you have the greatest sense. There's a few things here. And if we tackle supply, and we've suggested that the supply is there now, the question is, does it come down to demand? Does it come down to that last mile and getting it into people's arms? You also have a diverse range of vaccines available now. And depending on where they're going, be it a city, be it a rural area, whatever country it is, you have specific vaccines that perhaps fit better locations geographically too. Does that help unlock some of the challenges, do you think?
So thanks on that. And first of all, I want to say that, we have to keep in mind the inter-country inequities that exist now as well. So it is absolutely true what John has said of the shame of not having a global response. The original plan we put out was to have every high-risk person in the world vaccinated at the same time, every health worker, and then moving to low-risk people. And of course, that's not what happened. But we also have to keep in mind that some of the forces in wealthy countries that are actually making immunization be politicized there are spilling out into the rest of the world. So we're seeing more vaccine hesitancy. We're seeing more challenge. Now, the good news is that in general, developing countries actually appreciate vaccines more because they see the diseases. And so the vaccine demand has always been higher and vaccine hesitancy has actually been lower, but it's more complicated at this point. Now, into your specific question, supply is better, but it's not finished yet. I think we'll still have rocky supply for the next 6 months or so. And I'm a little worried, frankly, if there are new variant vaccines that we might have an inequity 2.0. So we have to be careful that that doesn't happen. And we have to make sure that the supply chains stay open. What then has to happen is, as I said, there are some countries where absorption is not at the pace it needs to be, and that needs to be really bespoke programs to look at what are the problems, solving those problems, and then there may be new problems. It may be political commitment in one place. It may be cold chain or supply chain or having enough vaccinators, and we need to solve those problems as we go forward. Last point is, it is great that we have a portfolio of vaccines right now. Not every vaccine is as easy to use as others, and therefore may not be appropriate. So, if I think about a country that has challenges, a big country, maybe you want to use your, minus 80-degree vaccines that require special syringes in your capital city, in your teaching hospitals. Maybe you want to use a single dose in your unstable areas or in refugee camps and do it as a campaign. And maybe you want a horse vaccine like Novavax, AstraZeneca, others in your rural areas where temperature stability and shelf life is really important. And so this is the type of conversation we have to have, working with countries to make sure they have the right vaccine in the right place at the right time.
Are those conversations being had?
Yes, absolutely. They are being had now, but not at the pace that we would like, because initially this was we're so short of vaccines, we'll take any vaccine that comes. And there was a scramble. There were vaccines that were sent with short shelf life. There were small quantities. We're now in a different place where we have the luxury to plan. And I have confidence in developing countries, because even the poorest developing country has high vaccination rates, is able to do campaigns. They've shown it over and over again. In fact, they're better prepared than wealthy countries. The issue is giving them the tools, the finance, and the planning time to be able to roll these products out.
Yeah, I mean, you said just before the end of the year, we need an extra $5.2 billion of additional funding in the next 3 months if we hope to hit that 70% target. So that's the kind of numbers that we're talking about. Mike, come in here, please. Would manufacturing hubs, patent sharing in certain locations, and I know Cape Town, and John, I'll come back to you on this because you and I have talked about this a number of times, would that help even today to have the vaccines in the right places, whether we're tackling the additional supply that's going to be required, trust and hesitancy, if it's manufactured in a country by the nation's own production facilities, does that make a difference in your mind? Mike?
One of the most scarce commodities in this whole pandemic response has been trust. Trust between communities and government, trust between countries, trust between manufacturers and purchasers. Trust has been the missing magic dust that makes everything work in life, in our society. I think we are faced with an existential crisis as a race and as a civilization on this planet. What is very clear, that the current mechanisms that are in place for the production of vaccines do not lead to the equitable distribution of these vaccines. We can sit here all night and we can discuss why that is, but that needs to be fixed, because we can't go around one more time like this. We have a tragedy on our hands, but we don't have an earth-killing virus. We have a virus that's killing millions of people. It's disrupting our hospitals, disrupting our society. But that's not necessarily the big one. That there are other challenges down the line. And if we're looking at this for the future, we don't have a system fit for purpose. And we don't have a system if we have a system that can produce enough vaccine, then tell me why it's not with the people who need it. And therefore, there is a great breach of trust. And I think many countries are looking now to say, okay, we need to strategically distribute that production capacity in a way that we can trust more in our likelihood of receiving vaccines from that at scale and more quickly. And I think it needs everything. We need to sustain our ability to carry out surveillance of this virus. We need to beef up and sustain our clinical care. We need to focus on vaccine production, delivery, right down to the last mile. And we need to do all of those things. So yes, we need to get involved in creating these technology transfer hubs. We need to have a multi-layered approach to this problem. Too much in this response, Julia. We've had the unicorn hunters and the silver bullet hunters of everyone looking for the single solution. In my experience in public health, there rarely is a single solution. Most complex problems in life require change at all levels. They require looking at every element of the system and defining what you need to do. Therefore, sometimes you don't need a massive change in the system. What you need is targeted change in the way business is done to make the system fit for purpose. Right now, it's very clear. We do not have a multilateral global system that is fit for purpose in dealing with what are global existential threats to our lives, to our societies, and to our economies. And it is the responsibility of the multilateral sector, the public and private sector, to come together and make the changes needed to make our system fit for purpose. Everyone has a stake in that. Everyone is a partner. Nobody is a master. And we've been too long discussing this issue around who's in charge. Everybody's in charge because everybody's at risk. So we need a multilateral, transnational solution with public-private engagement to find a robust mechanism and a robust means, not only to finish this pandemic, because what we come out of this pandemic will be what we take into the next one. And therefore, the lessons we learn now will define our performance in the next pandemic. There's no point saying, let's finish this one and we will see then what we do over the next 10 years. That's not the way it works. I'm doing this for the last 30 years. What you've learned at the end of the last one is usually what you take into the next one. That's the reality of life, because the world will move on to the next priority, the next crisis. So we also have a responsibility to come out of this pandemic with the skills and infrastructure that we need for the next one. That's our best chance of being ready.
John, I want you to come in here because you laid out the big picture and the failures, I think, but I need you to be specific about why more Africans at this stage, if some of the supplies are there, and we can even use South Africa as an example, because I know they've had the supplies and they still have less than 25% of their country vaccinated. What specifically is required? Is it help with logistics? Is it money? Or would it, in fact, help if you could manufacture those vaccines on the continent? Would that help with some of the skepticism that's being faced all around the world? But as we all recognize, I think, and you and I have talked about, John, before, it is faced on the continent too.
So, no, thank you. I'll come back to that, but let me pick up on where Mike ended about learning from this pandemic and taking the lessons to the next pandemic, you know. And because of the trust capital, what the diminishing effect of the trust capital, people have become cynical, and to the extent that we believe that we may not actually learn anything from this pandemic that will take us to the next pandemic, just because of the way we have conducted ourselves. I think behavior, in addition to the trust capital, their behavior at multiple levels have actually created cynicism, where you really think that we may document lessons but not actually learn lessons to take it to the future. I mean, the Ebola outbreak, if you take those Ebola outbreak reports that were written in 2016, you just need to Google, do search and replace Ebola and COVID-19, you get a report. Okay, you get a report ready to be submitted anywhere to characterize all what we need to fight the next pandemic. So with respect to what are we doing, what should we do at the continent? I think Seth mentioned this as well. We need better coordination. We need to look at this as a program. I think now that vaccines are beginning to come to the continent in a more predictable manner, let's sit down and set up some very specific targets and say, how do we get to 70%? You don't get to 70% by jumping from 10 to 70, but you set some very specific targets. Say this quarter, what do we need to do? And we build a coalition of partnerships that will enable us to get there. The limitations that the continent is having is mainly a challenge of logistics. Okay, and Seth mentioned that the vaccine hesitancy. Study after study, including our studies, is showing that 80% of the populations are ready to take vaccines if the vaccines are available. Studies after studies, I think no one can dispute that, including one published in Nature Medicine. We just published one ourselves recently, the World Bank there. So there's no doubt about that. The key is, what are the logistic challenges that we need to work on? We are engaging. I just had a meeting last week with our colleagues from USAID and said, look, let's work together. Seth and I, we all have our teams working in Morocco and Rwanda, building coalitions that can actually go in country and do that. We need more of such coordination so that we can do the delivery in a more systematic way and set short-term targets and achieve them. Why don't we say at the end of March, we should be able to demonstrate that we've arrived at 40% of the vaccination. If we do that by March, then we know that we are on our way, right, to getting to 70% by June or July. But without such targets, aggressive targets, and working together in a coordinated way, I don't think we are going to get there.
Yeah, and I think there's a chicken and egg problem here as well, to go back to Anna, your point about perhaps the demand versus supply. You don't want to ask for the vaccines if you don't have the logistics in place to get them in people's arms, or you end up with vaccines that are very close to expiry and you have to throw them away and they're too precious and too expensive for that. Anna, come in here, please. Of everything that you've heard, what do you see as some way to getting a solution? Because you have years and years and years of experience of providing vaccines for the world for other diseases.
So, I'd just like to add to what Mike and John and Seth have mentioned, that if you were to look at the lessons we've learned in the last 18 months, the only way, and I agree with Mike, there's no silver bullet or there's no magic solution, but there's a multiple number of things we can put in place for the future. And I think if you look at getting governments to sign agreements and coming together, I don't know, through the WTO or wherever else, to address a couple of issues. For example, export restrictions. To what extent can a country restrict exports, irrespective of their population? Because we're all in this together. That would be one point, which would help going forward. If we were to develop new vaccines, have another situation like this. In the meanwhile, I know we're trying to set up manufacturing hubs, and I hope we succeed doing something on the African continent as well, so they have their local manufacturing. But in the meanwhile, whilst we're still dependent on a number of limited manufacturers across the globe, you need export restriction bans to be addressed by governments, and I mean all governments. I'm talking about vaccine, trials and CMP, GMP standards being regularized, where, we all agree that this is one standard of clinical trials and other things that we follow, which perhaps the WHO, for example, would take the lead and everyone else would have to follow that. And I give that example because, there were so many different trials being done for different vaccines. And you talk about trust being misplaced and lost with the public. With all these different trials, different efficacy, oh my gosh, this, that, and the other, naturally to a layman or a public, you would be confused. Is this vaccine good? Is that vaccine good? What we saw happening is that everyone said, oh, we only want this vaccine, or we only want that vaccine. All that needs to be addressed going forward also. So one harmonized regulatory framework for pandemic level, development of vaccines as far as clinical trials and other regulatory licenses are concerned. Thirdly, for example, you saw this business about vaccine certificates. Some vaccines were approved, some were not. Even today, you have that, disparity. So causing huge trauma to people who've suffered. And now when they want to travel for work or pleasure, they can't do that. So, if we have one harmonized version of all of this, which countries come together and agree upon in the future, this would be a way of addressing and learning from the lessons so we don't make the same mistakes again going forward.
I think some of those things we could tackle now as we head towards trying to produce vaccines for variants as well, because as Seth pointed out earlier on the panel, we're at risk of inequality Mark II as we try to fight variants if we don't address getting vaccines to the whole world. But before we move on to that, because I do want to talk about that, Gabriella, you were nodding during that as well. And you raised a very important point about monopolies earlier on, whether that was nations hoarding, the export controls that we saw around the world. And I want to ask about price too. What's your sense of price? Is price part of the reason why we see inequality around the world and pecking order as far as nation states, COVAX, for example, or anyone else? Is that a worry based on what you're seeing, Gabriella?
Well, thanks very much for raising the question in that way, because yes, I was reflecting as the fellow panelists were speaking, we're not talking about that market logic that is at the center of what we're discussing here. So that's not being questioned, that there's a cost and pharmaceutical companies are setting those prices and different countries are paying them. And as a result, there are new billionaires in the pharma sector, CEOs and shareholders of Moderna or Pfizer and others. There's different ways, and different pharma companies have shown different approaches. So some of the COVID vaccines are being sold at cost. And there could be a way of coordinating, so that word that was used by John and Adar and Michael, how would we coordinate differently? But coordinating would require us to think of a vaccine that is there to enable the end of the pandemic, not there to fuel further profit and further hoarding as it is currently. So there is no need to continue within that logic, because in fact it is self-defeating for all. And this issue of the trust deficit that has been mentioned in this panel is a problem now. It's a problem for the addressing of this urgent challenge that we have, but it may be a very long-term consequence that we really need to address. So there's huge urgency, and there are several mechanisms to ensure that we have a much more collaborative approach that really addresses ending the pandemic, ending the cycle of inequality that is causing, and that includes collaboration. World Health Organization has set up those hubs that enable collaboration, but most pharma companies are not inclined to participate at the moment. And we see that they're holding power that is beyond the power that some national leaders have. So we need to question that we want to continue supporting a system that puts profits first instead of people's lives. And we believe that can be addressed by really comprehensively lifting the intellectual property restrictions that currently mean those monopolies are held by a few people.
Yeah, I was going to say, certainly from the perspective, and we heard from the Moderna CEO earlier this week on a panel in the World Economic Forum, and I know that Moderna have said that they're not going to enforce those patents, even if they're not participating directly in the hub that I know that opened up in Cape Town. But Ada, I do believe you're the person to respond to that. Some tough criticism there, I think, for the pharma industry, justified or not. We need to be better coordinated either way, surely.
Well, I think it's a balanced situation. See, from our angle, we've always been in the non-patented space, working and providing vaccines at $2 and $3 a dose. I can certainly understand, innovators backed by shareholders, and innovation does come at a price. So we have to balance it in a way that you can still fund innovation and new development, because without that, there's no progress on science. But of course, it can be balanced in a manner that, you don't just put profits ahead of lives, and you come upon agreements where you can, for, say, low-income countries, out-license products, which can be, manufactured at a lower price with manufacturers in India, China, Korea, so many parts, so that way you can, balance innovation and you get rewarded for it in the high price markets, but then you offer it at a very low cost or at cost, for the countries and nations which have very large populations and perhaps don't have the budgets, to vaccinate everyone, so that there's no inequality when it comes to saving one's life or protecting their lives. So I think that's a balance which everyone can strike, even if you're a Pfizer, Moderna and others. And I think they're doing that probably, by donating doses and things like that, that you've seen going on today. I don't know. I can't speak.
Go on. Yeah, you can't.
So, I think the interesting thing in this is it is in everybody's best incentive to get the right price. And the reason that's important to understand, in the routine vaccine market, if you can have a set of tiered prices, what it means is you maximize access and you maximize profit. And of course, that's what you're trying to do. In an emergency situation like this, it's much harder because obviously there are people who will pay anything for a vaccine, and it makes it very, very difficult. But if we look at the Serum Institute of India in this particular case, they had two technology transfers that they were able to take and frankly perform as well, if not better, than the parent companies in producing it. Now, unfortunately, they were sitting in a very large country that ended up with export bans. But if you could be in a situation where you had a Serum Institute of India sitting in Singapore, for example, you could saturate the whole population in an engineering run. Or if you had, two serums in Africa, then what you've got is the ability to move production around as is necessary during a pandemic. And Gavi's gone from having 5 manufacturers in 2000 to now 18. So we have seen an expansion of large, capable manufacturers. We don't need 200, but we need better geographic distribution of them, and they have to be sustainable manufacturers that can pivot to a pandemic vaccine, but not just for pandemics. That's critical.
I want to, because I'm conscious of time, I want to talk about fourth doses and the risk, as we've touched already upon, the fact that we're trying to tackle inequality Mark 1 and perhaps variant vaccines becomes inequality Mark 2 as the richer nations try and protect their populations first with those. Should the countries now that are not yet doing fourth doses but considering, or third doses, consider donating those to some of the poorer nations? This is a question from our audience. And Mike, I think it's a very valid one, because at some point it feels like this year we have to decide whether we're vaccinating against a virus or we're vaccinating against severe disease and death. And those two things are very different, because otherwise we're constantly chasing new variants versus just preventing death and severe illness.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a fair question. And I think Seth set it out in the beginning when COVAX was established between the partners. The primary aim was to protect at the beginning that 10% most vulnerable people around the world. It was around 10% that became 20% as we looked at a wider group, the health workers, the most elderly, people with underlying conditions. That was the primary objective at the beginning, was to take the death and hospitalization out of the pandemic by giving immediate protection to the most vulnerable everywhere at the same time. Yeah. We failed miserably in that. And the history books will note that. Now we come to where we are now, a slightly larger vaccine supply, but still some constraints, and we have choices to make. There is no question in my mind we need to still focus on those most likely to do worst by getting exposed or re-exposed, infected or reinfected. And that reality means that there are people living in high vaccine coverage countries who will require a third dose, and that is beneficial to them. If I'm an older person, if I'm someone with an underlying condition, it is very hard to, these equations are made. Should I give it to that person or should I give that? It doesn't matter what country you're in. The most vulnerable should get the proper primary course of treatment or vaccines. Some of those vaccines require a third primary dose. It's increasingly, I think, Seth, becoming clear that we are looking at, what we haven't really established, Julia, is we have a primary course of 2 doses. But as knowledge develops, and as we see the way the immune system matures in response to either re-exposure or to an extra dose of vaccine, we may end up in a future where the primary course of vaccination for a vulnerable person might be 3 or 4 doses. They won't be called boosters. It will be seen that you need 3 to 4 doses to develop that long-lasting, robust immunity that protects you from hospitalization and death over a prolonged period. So from my perspective, a vulnerable person living in an industrialized country who needs a third dose because they're very old and their immune system hasn't generated a response has an equity issue too, because their chance of dying is high. So we have to balance that. But the reality is there are 85% of people on the African continent haven't received a single dose of vaccine yet, vulnerable or not vulnerable. So there are literally millions of people living in low-income countries who are highly vulnerable, who haven't received a single dose of vaccine. Now, surely we can do both. Surely we can achieve both objectives. We can begin to accelerate, as John has advised, to accelerate coverage, starting with the most vulnerable in all countries, specifically targeting and prioritizing low-income countries, and particularly those on the African continent. And at the same time, we can give the extra protection to those vulnerable people in industrialized countries who already have high background levels of vaccination. I do not see these as opposing principles, Julia, and I would hope as we move forward, we look at these are 2 problems that have equal validity, and both need to be solved, and both need to be solved right now, because both are having an impact on the death rates around the world.
Yeah, inextricably linked. We have just a couple of minutes left, but I do just want to give you all just a brief moment to wrap up. And my final question is based on the challenges that we've presented, but how far we've come and the brilliance of science and the dedication of people like yourselves. So I thank you on behalf of those watching for all the efforts that you've put in. And we were joking at the beginning of this panel how tired everybody is. And I I know the work will continue. Do you believe that we end the pandemic this year, that we can end? We know we can, but do we end the pandemic this year? Your gut response, and just 2 sentences if you can sum up for me. Ade, you first, please.
Well, I think the definition of what we call a pandemic today is evolving every day, isn't it? Every month. I think as we see different variants of concern that might be milder, as we see vaccination coverage going up, and there will be a point, I mean, I'm not an expert, but, you know, I think there will be a point where we reach a certain level of vaccine coverage everywhere, and I hope that happens sooner than later. Based on the hospitalizations coming down, I think, you know, we will have to make a shift and say at some point, hopefully by, you know, end of this year, that, you know, if you're double, triple vaccinated, and, you know, the hospitalization rates come down and deaths come down, we can make that statement. Of course, that's for the experts to decide that. But I don't think that's outside of our grasp if all these things, you know, fall into place, and if we don't get new variants of concern and we press on with the vaccination coverage, I think that should be possible. I don't see why not.
2 very long sentences, but where you were headed there, which is where I was pushing you, is end the inequality. We hopefully end the pandemic, at least what it looks like. Gabriella, 2 sentences.
Yes, so I think it is possible if we change the model. Yeah. If we radically overhaul it and understand the enormous urgency and the importance of equitable distribution, which means production at scale across the world where needed. And the more it looks expensive or different, it's not, and it doesn't have to be. It's about distributing those resources differently. At the moment, they are being hoarded by a few companies and a few shareholders. That can be invested to really transform the way we're addressing the pandemic.
Yeah, John?
I think greater cooperation, greater solidarity is the route to ending this pandemic. Whether we end it in 2022 or in 2023, we need to reinstate that cooperation and solidarity.
Thank you. Seth?
I don't disagree with Gabriella, but distributed vaccine across the world is not going to happen in time for this year. Today, we have to get the vaccines out. The best we know right now is they protect against severe disease and death, and we got to do it before there is a variant that changes the equation. But right now, we have the tools, and the issue is making those available to everybody who needs them across the world, and we can do that.
Yeah, we have to get ahead of the worst variant that we've faced, and the way we do that is to try and get a majority of the world vaccinated wherever they are in the world. Final word, Mike?
We won't end the virus this year. We may never end the virus. These viruses, pandemic viruses, end up becoming part of the ecosystem. What we can end is the public health emergency. And that's why the Director General, Dr. Tedros, declared that emergency the end of January 2020. The issue is, it's the death, it's the hospitalizations, it's the disruption of our social, economic, political systems that's caused the tragedy, not the virus. The virus is a vehicle. It's how society has reacted to that virus and the presence of it. And as Gabriella said, long-standing inequities in health access, long-standing social inequities, huge internal inequities within countries, not just between countries. So yes, we have a chance to end the public health emergency this year if we do the things that we've been talking about for the last hour, but it won't end if we don't. And that's the reality. That this tragedy will continue. There is a chance. And remember in this, people talk about pandemic versus endemic, this word endemic. Endemic malaria kills hundreds of thousands of people. Endemic HIV, endemic violence in our inner cities. Endemic in itself does not mean good. Endemic just means it's here forever. What we need to do is get to low levels of disease incidence with maximum vaccination of our populations so nobody has to die. That's the end of the emergency, in my view. That's the end of the pandemic.
Yeah, define the fight, and then you can win it. Ladies, gentlemen, thank you so much. A pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to you, and thank you to our audience once again for participating and for viewing. Thank you.
you.